So now we move on to another one of the very iconic sights of Middle-earth with their telltale spectacle helms, the green, gold and brown colour scheme that they sport as well. ROHAN, which I think they're a fan favourite in terms of Tolkien's lore without any doubt, but in the game context they haven't been maybe quite as popular as some others, mainly because in the last version of the game the areas in which ROHAN are traditionally quite strong were areas which the meta didn't really reward last time around. So the whole game's shift towards making certainly cavalry options a little bit more viable has benefited ROHAN. Of course they have had some changes to their roster as well in terms of how a couple of things work, but for the most part it is the overall meta of the game shifting a little bit, which has been the biggest change to ROHAN, as I'm sure we'll get into in a moment. Obviously plenty of history to ROHAN as it stands at the time period we're concerned with in the Third Age. Of course they were really one of the first to really get involved in open hostilities, considering how quickly Isengard moved against them, although few forces of Middle-earth rose and fell as quickly as Isengard did, ROHAN still standing after the fact. ROHAN itself, of course, a relatively large realm compared to many of the others that exist within Middle-earth at this time frame, although much of that is the wide open spaces that you would expect for the Men of the Mark. There aren't actually too much in the way of settlements, maybe certainly less well built than their allies in Gondor to the south, but both of them have their foes and both of them will need one another's help if they are to survive on the campaign map, generally speaking. But we're more concerned with how they do in terms of their individual militaries here. So let's talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Rohirrim, and the first one is obviously very, very clear. It's cavalry, and it's cavalry universally as well, with their options that they have across the board. They do have a few more in certain areas. For example, lance cavalry is a big plus for them. They're able to do tons of damage off the charge, because pretty much all of their dedicated melee attack cavalry, shall we call them, are all wielding lances first and foremost. Also bow cavalry is something that they have plenty of options in as well, in terms of a horde of horse archers. Only can really come close to ROHAN in how many of them they can field, and they do have access to melee cavalry as well, albeit these are bound up in hybridized units with ranged units, so a unit of high-tier horse archers, a unit of javelin cavalry that wields a two-handed axe in melee as well. So they do have those options, but they're certainly more of an aggressive sort of total cavalry force, if you will, whereas again, Canned, their most direct comparison really in terms of their playstyle, are a little bit more defensive on horseback. That's really the difference between the two, so maybe a little bit of a higher risk with ROHAN, but the reward is also higher if you can get some of those devastating charges off, especially with those units of lancers that we will talk about a little bit later on. Speaking of which, in that high risk, high reward kind of vein, across the entire faction, aggressive weaponry is how I've termed it here, because it's not quite so simple as simply saying that they're good with armour piercing, albeit that is true. Plenty of their lance cavalry units deliver an armour piercing charge. They also have some of their scarier units in melee have got access to that armour piercing as well. Two-handed axes are certainly options that ROHAN have on foot. But the reason why you can't just call it armour piercing is the fact that many of their units also go for an axe or some sort of aggressive weapon and shield as well, which don't come with armour piercing by default, but do have higher base damages on the whole. And this is true of lower end units as well as, you know, hybrid units like the Metasol Guard. So good damage in melee, which you will need as ROHAN, because they do pay for this in other ways, but it's really a case of choosing your moment to advance forward with gusto. And obviously the cavalry is the most obvious way you can do that, because you can charge in and out very quickly, do large amounts of damage on the whole, but their infantry can also really help with that as well. If you go for the pincer attack, it's not so much hammer and anvil, but more sledgehammer and ball-peen hammer, if that makes any sort of sense at all, sort of sandwiching the enemy between two pretty scary forces when it comes to dealing damage, especially if your opposition is maybe a little bit too reliant on their armour. And playing into this as well, I mean, this is again a matter of weaponry, but it's a little bit more than just melee. It is their throwing weapons. They aren't the strongest throwing weapon faction in the game, much like their nearby rivals in Dunland that we've already spoken about. There are factions within the game that are better than them, but when you consider how it folds into their force as a whole, and I think the key really is the fact that this is also twinned with the fact they do have throwing projectiles on horseback, as well as pretty dangerous ones on foot. They have some basic lower tier javelins, which can be very useful from a cost efficiency perspective, as we have spoken about before. Also, stuff like the shield maidens are a very important unit for ROHAN. When you consider the close range damage that these guys can do when you twin it with their aggressive infantry, when you twin it with that cavalry which can deal the damage as well very, very quickly. These are ways in which you can really bust lines apart very, very quickly. Or if you're on the defence in a siege, you can utilise the throwing weapons in a more entrenched fashion, which you may not be doing in the open field because you want to be making good use of all that mobility, but Rohan do have options when they're on the defence, and it is the throwing weapons really where this is at its most obvious. However, Rohan do have some pretty clear downsides as well, and the first of those, we've spoken about how much damage they can do pretty much 3 different ways in terms of, maybe a little bit more slower pace with infantry with aggressive weapons, cavalry doing devastating charge damage, and then throwing weapons doing pretty heavy damage from close to mid-range as well. But their own defensive values are on the lower end of the spectrum when you compare them to, in particular, the other Western Kingdoms of Men. Pretty much everyone that's all around them, especially the Gondorians to the south, are the most obvious comparison in this regard, because Gondor really do prioritise that defence in terms of their armour, their shields, and their ability to outlast many other forces. Rohan don't. Now, there are units of them which can hold the line very well. Their higher end Westmark units are going to be good in this regard because they've got the spears, they've got the swordsmen as well, which against the right kind of units can actually do very, very well for themselves. But it's a combination of the armour and then the fact that you are going to have at least some of those axemen in melee, which tend to really focus the damage and the armour-piercing damage, but it does mean that their own melee defence suffers, so you're going to have maybe a little bit less staying power as Rohan. As a general rule, if the engagement is dragging on for a little bit too long, it's a bad sign for you. Your infantry is designed to deal with the situation quickly. Your whole army really is designed to really win engagements in a fairly swift manner, and if you find yourself not doing that, you may need to start rethinking how the battle is going. But fortunately, because of your mobility and your cavalry focus, generally speaking, you will have the opportunity to do that, whereas more static armies might not. But it is worth bearing in mind, you need to keep an eye on your numbers, because you don't have the same access to numbers as some of the evil men, and certainly not the orcs. So the lower defensive values can be a little bit of a problem if you allow that to go unheeded, basically. And another thing which we will be looking at is the army balance. I think the army balance of Rohan is... Because I'm not saying that going for a full or very cavalry-heavy army on the open field is necessarily the wrong thing to do, but there is obvious weaknesses to doing that and obvious risks. If you're not fully willing to take advantage of that mobility, then you are going to struggle, and if you're not able to get those charges off, you're going to struggle as well. But even when you consider things from a more generalised perspective, if Rohan, you can go essentially no cavalry, a little bit of cavalry, or lots of cavalry. Those are your options, really, as Rohan. If you're on the defence in a siege, for example, how much cavalry you go for is one of the main choices that you can make, but you kind of know what force of infantry that you're going to be dealing with as Rohan, and again, that slight tilt towards being a more aggressive force can mean that the opposition will try to really take advantage of that, and the lower defensive values in general are also going to play into that. But you kind of need to bring a little bit of cavalry, I think, as Rohan, if you are going to take full advantage of what they're all about as a faction. You can go infantry, full infantry, but I think that especially it's more when you're in a siege situation, I think, where the battle is a little bit more constricted and you need to try and take advantage of some of those aggressive infantry units that you have. But I'm not too convinced that Rohan have as easy a time of doing that as Canned, even still. Canned, with the slightly more defensive options that they have both on horseback and in melee, can pivot into that kind of battle a little bit more easily perhaps than Rohan. Again, you can try and take the fight to the enemy even if you're in a dug-in position, but I think that Rohan will be... They're an excellent foil for other factions when you're in a siege, if you're going alongside one of the more traditionally defensive stalwart factions like Khazad-dûm or Gondor to the south, of course. Then Rohan can act alongside them very, very nicely. But if you're talking about them in a vacuum where it's only Rohan against one other faction in this sort of situation, you may struggle a little bit more than would be ideal. But you're not defenceless in this regard by any means. I think it's just a case that you need to be careful. If you don't balance your army appropriately for your opposition and for the map, which is a little bit more of a key thing with Rohan, then you may find yourself struggling. And part of this is the fact that they do lack one type of weapon very noticeably. They've got no long weaponry. They've got no phalanx units, no two-handed spears, no halberds, no pikes, which means when it comes to digging in or, holding a centre, even on an open field, they can be in a little bit more trouble if this is something that you tend to rely upon. They're not the only faction in the game with no phalanx units whatsoever. Merc would come immediately to mind, and both of them go about dealing with that absence in different ways. Of course, on the open field, Rohan are much more about that mobility, that shock damage, all of that sort of thing. Merc were a little bit more about dealing damage from afar with their ranged units and then relying on sheer quality in melee. But we've already mentioned that Rohan can't necessarily do that unless they're able to smash their enemy to splinters quickly because of that slightly lower defense. But the fact that you have no long weaponry takes away your ability to anchor yourself in place, which again is maybe more of a concern in a siege battle, because it means that you're not able to really clog up those choke points or advance into them with any sort of backing for your mainline units. You are going to be still reliant on those higher end Westmark units to try and take a little bit more of the damage in that respect. But I think it's more the sort of thing which will take shape as we move on to the grassy plain and take a look at some of these units in general. I don't think we're going to be able to fit them all in one big go, but maybe we will, I don't know. But we will start off with maybe the foot-based units first and then deal with the cavalry in its own section, considering how many of them there are. So let's head over there now and take a look at the Rohirrim up close and personal. So here we are then with Rohan's roster on the grassy plain, and I was wrong. We can actually fit all of them into one area, and a large part of that is the fact that only 2 of them have access to armour upgrades, and they don't actually make any sort of visual difference, so I didn't need to double them up in that respect. But you can see very clearly over there onto the left hand side of the screen, they do have those cavalry units, the numbers in terms of their units on horseback that we would expect from them, but less so on the right hand side. Again, not something which should be too surprising to most people, I would imagine, but we'll see what they have at their disposal as we go through, and we will be starting with their infantry, which on the face of things looks a little bit sparser than many other factions. But we start with, strangely enough, not actually a completely dedicated infantry unit either, Eastmark Spearmen, which are a hybrid unit. They've got the javelins as well as being basic spears in melee, and of course it is the fact that they have access to those javelins which really sets themselves apart. In terms of their melee stats, they're actually not terrible when you consider things. I mean, a lot of the defensive score does come from the shields, which does mean that's only really truly useful against the projectile units, but even so, many units that we've seen already, like their melee attack is far lower even than 5. Even when you can factor in the spear malice, that does mean they're going to have a little bit more about them than many other types of units, but again, paying that little bit more at 500. It's the javelins as well that you're really paying for here. I mean, in terms of more numerous units, as we'll get onto in a moment, Rohan on foot, certainly in comparison to the other Western kingdoms and sort of more generally as well, they do need to bulk out their army with numbers, and I think the Eastmark Spearmen are the main way that you're going to be doing that, because not only do you have the extra punch of those javelins, but the numbers themselves are going to be important. But don't be relying too much on them for their defensive prowess. I mean, a decent amount of damage can be achieved by this kind of unit, and indeed when you're on the defence in a siege or on the attack in a siege, cheap javelins very often are guaranteed value for money. Even on the open field, you're going to need the numbers. The map control that you can get from anti-cavalry units in conjunction with your own cav numbers can be important as well. So you should never discount your entry-level forces, and I think the Eastmark Spears are going to be a bit of a stalwart among the Rohan roster just to help tie their army together, but they're not match winners by any stretch of the imagination. And when it comes to their entry-level forces, we already mentioned how their infantry can be another damage-dealing vector that they can utilise. And the reasonably cheap Ridmark Axemen as well at 550 are another way that you can deliver some good damage, some good armour-piercing damage unto your enemies. Again, another force which gives you over 200 men in a unit, the effectiveness against armour, big attack value and charge bonus as you would expect from this kind of shock infantry unit. But as you would also expect with this kind of unit, the defensive values are where they do fall down a little bit. They do have a shield, slight shield value from wearing their shields on their back, so they're not completely defenceless against projectiles, but still reasonably low armour, reasonably low shield value, certainly a low defensive skill as well. If they're allowed to engage completely free of any support, then they will struggle. It's not too dissimilar to the kind of downsides that you would expect from a basic unit of axemen from one of the evil men factions, or even some of the orcs, in fact. They may have a little bit of an edge on them in terms of stats when you compare them to something like, you know, the orc fellas of Angmar, for example, but it's not a huge amount, it's not a huge step up. So you will need to use them in conjunction with some of your other units, whether it's the numbers of the Eastmark spearmen, or whether it's the slightly bigger quality units that you get from the Westmarks, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You do need to use them in conjunction with others if you really want to get the best out of them. But again, reasonably cheap, reasonably big damage as well if you can utilise them well, and numbers as well, which, as we'll talk about right now, will prove to be an important aspect of the Eastmarks and the Ridmarks that we've talked about, because if you're going to build a solid front line, then undoubtedly you're going to be doing it around the Westmarks. When you talk about their stats, I mean, the attack of 10, the total defensive values as well. I mean, the total defense actually, in terms of their defensive skill, in some ways gives them a little bit of an edge over their fellow Western kingdoms. And 600 is not a huge amount to spend on them either. It's very comparable when you consider their stats in many ways are actually slightly better. The main downside, however, is the numbers. The numbers being only 133, that means they have a significant amount of soldiers per unit less than, for example, the Arnorians or the Gondorians to the south, or the Dalians even to the north. It does give them a little bit of a disadvantage there. There are certain advantages, like we said, we already mentioned, maybe the slightly higher stats overall, the inspiration of nearby troops as well, and this is something which we'll also notice as we go through Rohan as a faction. They've got plenty of units which inspire nearby troops, which means morale issues shouldn't be too much of a problem, although much of that is going to be going into keeping your Eastmarks and Ridmarks from fleeing, because, you know, everyone can try and inspire one another, I suppose, but I think it mostly will speak to the fact that if you start to fall apart in terms of morale as Rohan, it's a sign that the battle really is lost, because many of your units will be encouraging the others nearby to fight. It's nice to have as well, because these are the kinds of units which are going to be on the front line. They're going to be in the pit, and they're going to be fighting alongside units which the ones in front of them will need that extra boost. And it's all about how you build your line. So good quality, but the lack of long weaponry and the slight lack of numbers may prove to be a little bit of an issue in the long run. Now the spears, one thing that we have seen so far as well is that the spears tend to have slightly less men in the unit than their swordsman equivalent, but that's not true of Rohan. Both of them have 133, which still means ultimately the spears are less numerous than, for example, the Gondorian spears. However, they also have the inspiration effect, which is nice to have, and in terms of their defensive abilities, again, very similar. The attack is lower with the shield value, but units like this, you often want them to be that defensive bulwark rather than doing any sort of meaningful damage as such. 625 is reasonably low as well. When you consider the stats, and you take everything other than the numbers of the unit out of the equation, this looks fantastic, maybe too good. But the lower numbers are a concern. It is really where the Rohirrim infantry does fall down a little bit in comparison to their peers, and it's all about how well you build your army, because their cavalry force is generally going to be much bigger than the enemy's when you're on the open field anyway, and it's also how you fold in your infantry force with your ranged units as well. That's going to be key. 1-to-1, they will do quite well, the Westmark units in general, against many oppositions, but you need to put the right force around them, otherwise though their slightly lower numbers may come back to haunt you. A unit which I could maybe have put in the slightly higher tier than this, the Westmark Marshals, 850, big step up in terms of cost, and they are just the big brothers really of the Ridmark Axemen that are just in front of them. There are fewer of them, of course, 123, but that's kind of par for the course in terms of numbers. When you get up to units of this quality and this sort of recruitment cost, you're condensing a lot more expertise into individual units. They also inspire nearby troops, which is nice, but they also twin that with frightening nearby enemy infantry. So if you can land a big charge with the big attack value and the big charge bonus that these guys have, which, as I've already mentioned, is a little bit more difficult on foot than it is on horseback, but if you can do it with the Westmark Marshals, it's just another one of those potential morale breaks that you can cause, which shock damage in general for Rohan is going to be one of the main ways in which you do business, especially if you're going up against a slightly more fragile faction in this regard, like the Orcs, some of the evil men, or some of the fellow, kingdoms of men that Rohan consider allies even. You can really start to rattle the enemy in terms of their mental fortitude if you can twin all of these attacks together. The Westmark Marshals will certainly do that, and even their defensive values are not bad. I mean, again, defensive skill of 9, obviously a heavy swordsman of this type and cost would be much higher in that regard, but that's the downside of being a heavy axe unit. You have the big armour-piercing swings that come with them, but lower in terms of the defensive skill. But 9 is still decent enough. They won't fold as quickly as the Ridmark axemen in front of them, for example, but you do still want them. You charge in with the axes and then follow it up with some support as quickly as you can, so that they're not isolated for too long. Decent armour for a Rohirrim unit as well. They even got slight shield value as well, because just like the Ridmarks, they do wear that shield on their back also. And then the bodyguard unit that Rohan have at their disposal, the Helm Hammers, 1200 for them, and this is where things turn around perhaps a little bit. I mean, armour-piercing weapon and shield units for bodyguard units are not exactly the norm. We have seen the Uruk chieftains already, but the Helm Hammers are a step above them. They too inspire nearby units, but that's more par for the course for bodyguard units anyway. Effectiveness against armour we've already mentioned, frightening nearby enemy infantry as well, so they're more about inspiration than they are about inflicting fear, Rohan, but they're certainly adept at doing both. Now, total defense of 40 is extremely high, but the one thing that you must bear in mind is that a fair amount of that is a result of them wielding those great shields. So 15 of that is really put into dealing with projectile damage exclusively. But even if you take that into account, they are still, defensively at the very least, a significant step up in comparison to all of the other infantry units that Rohan have at their disposal, as you would expect from the bodyguards perhaps, but even with the rule of equivalency, it's still a big jump, maybe a little bit of dwarven influence on these guys perhaps. Second hit point also helps a lot with that. Big armour, big defensive skill, big attack as well for a unit which, you know, seems to certainly visually prioritise defence and in terms of the stats as well, but good armour piercing damage. If you're trying to dig yourself into a defensive position in a siege, then the Helm's Hammers are pretty must have, because they really do take things to the next level in terms of their defensive abilities. But yeah, big damage on them as well with those hammers. Another important part of the Rohirrim roster is going to be in their projectile units, albeit maybe their entry-level unit, which we see here does have an armour upgrade, albeit it's not a visual one. The Eastmark Archers, basic in terms of this sort of unit. I mean, again, missile attack of 5, that's slightly higher than the lowliest units from like the Orcs or the Men of the East and that sort of thing. However, in terms of their numbers, they don't really have the numbers, much like, you know, a lot of the Rohirrim infantry don't. They don't have the numbers to be that swarm force on foot. So in terms of trading back and forth, I think the Eastmark Archers, if you're going for a heavy foot archer force, it needs to be in conjunction with the higher tier option, and you need to be sure that you're going to be able to gain good value off of them. So it really does depend on who you're facing off against. If you're facing off against a force with ample heavy archers, for example, for whom skirmishing is very comfortable, then you would probably recommend going for, you know, more of a cavalry, more of an aggressive focused army. But if you are going up against a force which maybe doesn't have quite so much in the way of archers, or maybe you're a little bit weak in that regard, then going for the Eastmark Archers, who are, again, like we said, basic, defensively, maybe a little bit compromised even with the armour upgrade and don't have the stakes, but cheap. And if you combine that with a unit which is maybe a little bit more comfortable in this regard, in the Helming Gas, another unit which has remained with us ever since vanilla, they have got one more missile attack. They're a little bit better in melee. They're certainly better defensively, and again, step up in terms of cost, but this is pretty much the Rohirrim equivalent of slightly heavier skirmishing archer, stuff like the Bardian Marksman, for example, but they don't really do the business in that regard to as high a standard, but it is still an option that you have as Rohan. Many factions who come up against their opposition, like they either have an archer force which is able to do the job or they don't. For Rohan, it very much depends on who you're going up against as to whether I'd recommend certainly the Eastmark Archers, but also the Helming Gas. I mean, if you're in a siege, if you're in a defensive siege, then you are going to need the range damage that these guys provide, and ultimately, you know, they're decent enough in melee to the point where they will do a job later on for you to try and see you over the line as well. But it's not quite so cut and dry as it would be with a faction like Gondor or Dale, for whom that is a very big part of their identity. For Rohan, it's a little bit more something you need to ask a question about, but one thing that you don't need to ask a question about whatsoever is how important the Shield Maidens are. Now, the Shield Maidens, they too, slightly better actually in melee than the Helming Gas, slightly more expensive, but certainly more damaging at range. A missile attack of 12, not armour piercing damage, but the base damage of throwing axes still very, very impressive, of course. They too inspire nearby troops, so it's another one of those units that Rohan can depend upon to boost their morale up close. But also, we've already mentioned the fact that they don't have access to any phalanx infantry, so they need options in terms of how to deal with them. Obviously, any sort of bowman is going to be able to do that, either the foot ones that we've already mentioned, or the horse archers that we will mention a bit later on. But perhaps the best option for doing that, especially if you're able to advance close to the enemy foot positions, going to be the shield maidens, because there are no shields generally to worry about to help mitigate the damage. The high base damage means you're going to be able to blow holes in those formations pretty quickly, and then as a result of that, one of the clearest threats to your cavalry dominance will be gone from the field, and also your infantry will be in a much better position to be able to go toe-to-toe with the enemy up close and personal with that damage that Rohan can bring to bear even on foot. Bonus fighting cavalry as well. No second hit point as you would expect. 750 is a very reasonable cost, I think, for a unit that's capable of dishing out this much damage, but do be careful, only 123 of them, so if they do start to fall away quickly, you can find your DPS decreasing pretty rapidly there. But also in a siege, completely irreplaceable, really. I don't think there's going to be many times that you will see Rohan take to the field without their shield maidens. Now then, the final force we have here, as far as their foot projectiles go, are the Metasol Guard. Now, Bodyguard tier javelin units are not exactly commonplace in the game. Off the top of my head, you have the Reforged javelins of Rudawa, you have the Demons of the Desert from Harad as well, both of which probably will be better in terms of an aggressive unit, but the Metasol Guard, I think, are the most well-rounded unit of this type that the game has to offer. Again, inspires nearby troops, but from a bodyguard unit, you would expect that. Bonus against cavalry, effectiveness against armour, but it's really the missile damage there. You've got the 10 missile damage, which is not all that much less at a baseline than the shield maidens just in front of them, but it adds armour piercing to that as well, so you're going to do tons of damage to the right kind of unit. But what sets these guys apart from the units that I just mentioned from other factions of this type is the fact that they are well-rounded in melee as well. Like, these are the kind of stats that you would expect to see on a just straight-up sword and shield bodyguard unit from many other forces, but they add that extra damage from afar to it. I mean, that's a big defensive value. I mean, defensive skill of 12 is really, really good for a unit of this type, especially when you consider it's not a stat that Rohan placed too much emphasis on, especially not with many of their infantry units that we've already seen. A second hit point, good armour as well, good melee attack. I mean, 17 is very, very strong indeed. And 1200, I think in a siege, they're pretty much a no-brainer. On the open field, it really depends on how cavalry heavy you want to go as to whether you would bring a unit like this. But again, that's the decision that you have to make, really. One of the main calls that you have to make as Rohan overall. But like I said, in a siege, I think you're going to see these guys every single time. But the cavalry is where you're going to have to be winning certainly a lot of your field battles with, and even sallying out or trying to make use of them in a siege as well may very well be one of your safer bets. And the whole meta of the game shifting to allow this kind of unit to be more viable has really rescued Rohan from the doldrums, because I think previously they may very well have been the weakest faction in the game, because they didn't have the fallback options that Canned have, and that is still a dynamic that exists between the two of them. Rohan are much more focused around dealing that damage, dealing that shock damage quickly, but now it is viable. Like I said, Arid of Aldberg, we've seen Rohan cavalry heavy forces on the open field in the recent tournament and in just general battles actually be used to good effect. And the Arid of Aldberg, with their numbers, with the damage they can deal off the charge bonus of 15, which is armour piercing, it's all the sort of thing that you would want. Big damage potential off a unit that only costs 700, and decent defensive values as well. One thing that you will have to look out for with Lancers is how well are they going to be able to cope with damage. Like, you want to keep them moving, you want to keep them out of engagements for the most part until you're ready to charge in with spears lowered. But how well are they going to be able to deal with a few melee hits? How well are they going to be able to deal with a few arrows coming their way? And the armour values, the defensive skill, the shield, all of that means that you are going to have some sort of fallback option in that regard. Obviously, keeping them out of the firing line in that regard for as long as possible is important. But yeah, it's definitely something which you can do far more easily than you were able to in the last version of the game now. And then, effectively, just the bodyguard tier variant of them are the Lords of the Mark. Rohan have 2 Lance Cavalry bodyguards, which is not terribly surprising given their focuses. 1200 for a unit like this, and pretty much it's just the big brother of the unit in front of them. It adds, again, inspiration. We've already mentioned in some of the other factions that inspiration on a unit like this is less important than it is for the units on foot, because you need to keep this cavalry moving anyway, so you'll be taking them out of the radius where the inspiration aura will be having an effect. It's nice to have, but it's certainly not the be-all and end-all. The frightening nearby enemy infantry, however, is more significant. If you're able to land those big heavy charges in behind, do tons of damage quickly, then crumpling the enemy's morale is something that ROHAN definitely have in the locker. We already mentioned a little bit with their infantry, but certainly with their shock cavalry, it can be absolutely devastating. And just like with the unit in front of them, looking at their defensive abilities as well, same sort of charge bonus, same sort of attack. They don't have a bonus against other cavalry units. That's the other Bodyguard Lance cavalry unit that we'll talk about in just a moment. So you do want to be keeping them out of harm's way from really dangerous melee cavalry if you can, albeit ROHAN can use their numbers to simply overwhelm them, and the Lords of the Mark do have the stats and the second hit point to the point where they won't be crushed underfoot by that kind of unit too quickly. Second hit point, like I said, good defensive stats also. But in terms of all-round, the Sons of Eorl over here are pretty much the crown jewel of the Rohirrim army in general. 1500 is a lot. I've already mentioned with the Gwythi Roctor, though, what this kind of unit is really capable of. They might be slightly less well-rounded than the Enladris unit equivalent, but when you look at all of these stats, a charge bonus of 20, big defense as well for a ROHAN unit, and 14 defensive skill is nothing to be sniffed at when you consider the second hit point as well. And yeah, they also have the inspiration, maybe not the most important thing for the same reason as the Lords of the Mark. They also have a bonus, well, they have the effectiveness against armour off the charge, they frighten nearby enemy infantry, but it is that bonus fighting cavalry and the slightly higher charge bonus which really does set them apart. It really does put them onto that next level. If you're able to land the charge on an opposition unit of cavalry as well, that's only going to really twist the knife just that little bit more so. But yeah, the centre piece of any sort of ROHAN cavalry charge is going to be these guys. However, one thing that also sets ROHAN apart is their ability to field a ton of horse skirmishers, and the Eastmark horse archers, unlike their variant on foot, I think you'll be seeing much more of the Eastmark horse archers in general because of the mobility. They're actually not that much less of them. And usually the difference between a basic unit of horse archers and the faction's most entry-level archer unit is pretty significant, but it's actually not so much with ROHAN, which probably shouldn't be too much of a surprise, I suppose. But 675, again, decent in terms of their ability to take a bit of damage. You don't want to park them in front of really damaging archers, but you're not doing your due diligence with your horse archers if you're doing that in the first place. Missile attack of 5 is par for the course for most entry-level archer units. You can form shooting circle as well, which is something you can do to try and help mitigate damage that's coming your way. But for the most part, keeping them moving is going to be your best bet. And if you twin that with the unit just in behind them, which is effectively just a very slightly bulkier version of them, again, pretty much the same performances in melee, pulling out those axes, the Riders of the Fold, but slightly better defensively, slightly better when it comes to dealing damage with those arrows, but that's really the only difference between the two of them, and it just allows you to build up a big force of horse archers, of course, because you can have 2 of each of these guys before going into the red limit, which would be a unit of 4 units of horse archers in total. That's a lot to be dealing with. It's a lot of harassment that you can put onto the enemy, and it's easy enough, I think, to mitigate the presence of 1 or 2 units of horse archers, but when you start to see the amount that a force like ROHAN or like Khand can start throwing at you, that's when things start to get a little bit more chaotic. And if you take your eye off the ball, that's where ROHAN can really thrive with some of their ability to deal shock damage and deal damage with their throwing projectiles, and all of that can begin based on the chaos that you can sow with horse archers. And also, let's not forget, horse archers, while it's not their modus operandi, they are still capable of doing or delivering fairly reasonable charges. The charge bonus of only 1, but it's the mass of horse archers that actually delivers the damage here. So late game, if you're just looking to get yourself over the line and you've got some horse archers still available to you, that can make all the difference in the world. They're not going to have the same impact as the lancers we've already seen, of course, but they can still do a job for you in that regard. Now, much of the force that we've mentioned so far has not really been about securing you the cavalry domination on the field outside of their most expensive unit, but the Ridmark skirmishers are an out-and-out cavalry hunter unit, really. They've got the javelins, which most javelin cavalry is going to be pretty good at hunting down other cavalry in general. They have a bonus fighting cavalry as well, pulling out those 2-handed axes, and they've got a big melee attack to do that as well, so they're certainly capable of dishing out a fair amount of punishment, as is kind of the case with ROHAN overall. their defensive values, particularly their defensive skill, is not super high, so you definitely want to be trying to whittle down the enemy with those javelins first before then moving in for the kill with your aggressive axes and that melee attack, because you don't want to be getting involved in a back and forth when your defensive skill is as low as 4, and especially when 750 is a fair amount of money to spend on a unit like this. So as with much of Rohan's cavalry, it is micro intensive to get the most out of them, but if you do, they can be a very, very difficult thing to get rid of. Obviously they're at their very best if you can combine them with the Sons of Yule. That can be a really scary melee cavalry force, that, but you don't always have the luxury of that. Wrangling this much cavalry on the open field is difficult, but if you do want to achieve cavalry domination, and as Rohan you certainly should, then the Ridmark skirmishers are pretty much the most straightforward way of doing that without having to rely on charges and weaving through the enemy. The Ridmark skirmishers can simply hunt down units of cavalry with their javelins and then also give them the business with those two-handed axes in melee. Just be careful, as with most of the entry-level Rohan, or non-high tier Rohan stuff, they do have some defensive shortcomings. But as we move into the higher tier, they do have another unit of, well, I guess this is a hybrid unit really, melee cavalry and bow cavalry hybrids. The Red Shields of Erkenbrand, who also have a bonus fighting cavalry. They're much more straightforward as a melee cavalry unit though. Similar kind of melee attack, albeit it's not the armour-piercing axes of the Ridmark skirmishers in front of them. Big missile attack as well at 8. They are reasonably expensive at 900, but if you're going for that full horse archer experience as Rohan, then you'll have 4 units of the basic horse archers that are in front of them, led by the Red Shields, which are just a much better unit all round. Again, better missile attack, able to act as melee cavalry in melee because of the bonus fighting cavalry and the good stats they have. And also defensively, they're pretty damn good as well. They're going to be able to shrug off a decent amount of damage from afar from missiles. Their shield value will help them with that, good armour, but the defensive skill is where they really shine, and that's a good sign for their performances as melee cavalry units go. But yeah, very well-rounded unit all round this, and I can see them even being a big part of sort of defensive sieges or offensive sieges, because you can utilise them to deal with any sort of enemy cavalry that might reveal itself, but also as far as an archer unit goes, it's still pretty good. Again, that missile attack of 8 is higher than anything that they have on foot outside of throwing projectiles, so yeah, I can definitely see that being the case. And then finally, the artillery, the Dwarves of the Glittering Caves, are represented here with a Dwarven catapult, and a catapult obviously being a more aggressive unit of siege weaponry, you can more easily crumble walls and fortifications. The splash damage that they deal as well to crowds of units going to be really, really devastating. And obviously not every force has got access to catapults now. We've already seen with the elves that they only have access to ballistae, which can be a bit more user-friendly maybe on the open field, and I don't think you'll see the Dwarven catapult too much on an open field unless Rohan are involved in like a team game and the players beforehand simply decide that the Dwarven catapult will be the way to go. But for the most part, I think it's going to be one of Rohan's primary go-tos in a siege, whether attacking or defending, because you're going to be able to do big amounts of splash damage with it, of course, and put the enemy under big, big pressure. And even if you are on the receiving end perhaps of some of Medieval 2's wonderful RNG when it comes to its artillery, where if you hit maybe your own units more than the enemy, a lot of the time that can leave you in a bit of bother in a morale sense, but with all of their inspiration units, maybe Rohan won't be put under the cosh quite so much by the game for that. And obviously the Dwarves, unsurprisingly, one of the most well-armoured units that Rohan have at their disposal outside of some select bodyguard units. Total defence of 21, obviously more of a defensive kind of unit this, but another good option. I mean, considering 900, you're getting 103 decent quality dwarves in for the deal as well, in addition to the sheer damage that a catapult can chuck out. It's hard to argue against them, really, is it? I'd be interested to see what sort of open field compositions do that, because if you do bring a catapult on the open field, it's a sign that you need to be a little bit more static, and Rohan, with all of this cavalry, certainly for the most part, I think will want to be a little bit more fluid, but I don't know. We shall see. We shall see as the weeks and months go on how Rohan fit into the meta. So there we have it. They're an interesting kind of force, Rohan. In many ways, they still have all the same weaknesses that they had in the last version of the game. It's really the meta of the game shifting as a whole which has changed them the most, but it's just made them viable, essentially. But yeah, I will be interested to see how they get on because, like I said, in the last version of the game, I really do think they were the weakest faction overall. But with the changes to Cavalry, that probably isn't the case any longer. But I think separating the wheat from the chaff in terms of the players who play as Rohan, I think how well you can utilise your somewhat limited infantry and fold it into your more dangerous skirmishers, and certainly more dangerous cavalry is going to be the interplay which really does separate the men from the boys when playing as Rohan, so to speak. But yes, I think we shall be moving on now, thinking ahead to who we're going to have a look at next. And I think actually we will return to an elven faction first and foremost. And I think what we will do, another faction, just to keep with the theme, that maybe wasn't quite so strong in the last version of the game, but in this one has been made a lot better, is Linden. For very different reasons than Rohan. But yeah, the Elves of Linden will be who we look at next time around. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for that.